Are you guys excited to see the cross-plane R1 swap to Yfz450? Well, guess what? Me too. And when you guys get super excited, so do I. So if you want to see this thing roar to life, stick around because I've got some stuff in store for you. All right, welcome back, Stupid Fast Nation. Hope y'all are having a great, fantastic, and magical week and weekend. We're getting back to work on the R1 swapped Yfz450, this beautiful, harmonious, heavenous sounding cross-plane R1. Yes, they sound incredible. Check out this sound clip here. So yeah, guys, we've got a good bit of work to do before we can actually get this thing ready for powder. In this video, we're gonna start working on throttle body placement and the airbox assembly and getting the upper portion of this frame shaped out in the way we need it to be able to fit everything into this area. And then also, I think we're gonna put the battery up here by the front of the steering stem, and then that will be right behind the curvatures we need to do in order to fit the airbox and throttle body assembly. So, we've also got to get the front of the down tubes on the frame here back to the lower portion of the frame. And there's a couple other little odds and ends we're going to take care of while we're in here. And then once we're done with that, this motor actually has to come out and get a full rebuild from head to toe. I will go through that in the next video. We're not going to do that in this video. And I'll talk to you guys about that whole situation. But let's get started with getting this YFC R1 beast done. Time to get this bad mamma jamma back to a state of being that we can just simply enjoy. Let's start by cutting out this top section of the frame. With the engine being mounted in all positions, the frame won't be able to move if we cut the top supports out. It's things like this that I take a lot of time thinking through which pieces to fab up next and in what order, so that we can avoid potential issues, like wasting materials by having to make new supports to hold everything together sturdily while we finish our fabrication and design. Once we get our top supports cut out of the way, we can move on to reshaping new pieces that fit around the airbox and battery. Now, one thing I would like to point out here, no microphone, no nothing, just real quick, is that you can see this frame has not moved at all because the engine has both the back mounts and also these front mounts tying into the front of the frame. So this frame will not have any flex as long as we don't do anything like set it on the ground on wheels or anything. There should be no flex at all just sitting here on the table. That's why you can see my cuts and like nothing really moved at all. So Alright guys, so now that we got the center section of the top piece of the frame kind of cut out of the way and we can kind of get an idea of how things are going to fit, I have tossed up a lot of ideas in my head and how I'm going to proceed with this plan moving forward. And I'll clue you guys in on some really cool specific details here. I do actually plan on, not now, in the beginning of the build, but after we get this thing running and riding over the winter, I would like to do a twin turbo setup on this R1 motor. So with that being said, I have a plan of putting turbos up here by the headlights and then putting LEDs on the front of the turbos. I think that would look really freaking sick. But with that being said, what we have to do is get this thing running naturally aspirated first. I don't even know anybody that tunes these bikes yet. And so I'm not ready to get to that stage just yet. So what we're gonna do is use the stock airbox, which I did not get the lid or anything for. I have one on order on eBay, won't be here till next week, but I have a good idea of where everything's gonna sit. I have a picture up on the TV behind me and kind of just using that for reference. And so we don't need this front section that I thought we were gonna need. We can cut this out, and then we're gonna do tubing around the sides of the throttle bodies. And then so that way we can just use the stock airbox. I'll wind up cutting the front of the airbox off because the filter sits right up here, and then the battery will go up here, and then all of the associated wiring can just directly connect to there and to the frame. So with that being said, the reason why I'm keeping the stock airbox for now, for two reasons. One is the velocity stacks on the inside of the airbox, and number two is there is actually a secondary set of fuel injectors above the velocity stacks, and when this bike gets up to the upper RPMs, the secondary injectors pulse and pull more fuel in. So in order to delete those and run a custom intake setup on this, you actually have to have somebody who knows how to flash tune these ECUs, and you can tune that map out of the ECU. But unfortunately, I don't have anybody offhand that can do that for me. If you guys know somebody, comment below. So until I get software and I learn how to do it myself over the winter, we're kind of stuck with the stock airbox for now. I know it's gonna look, it won't look bad. I don't think it's gonna look bad because I am still gonna use the plastic in here, and we will use a part of the tank cover to cover majority of this. So really you're only gonna see a tiny bit of the airbox anyways, but I always personally thought it looks kind of funky with the airbox sticking out. So we will be going back at some point and changing that to a custom intake for the twin turbo setup. But for now, we're just gonna run the stock airbox. So let's go ahead and get this cracking. With the airbox in place, we can get a really good idea of what needs to happen next. The back section of the frame that I originally left untouched, well, it turns out my original idea of coming over top of the airbox to reconnect to the frame just isn't going to work anymore, so we had to come up with a solid plan B. My version of a plan B is going to be curving around the outsides of the airbox to leave room specifically above it to keep it more OEM looking, rather than completely deleting the gas tank cover and going full marketplace build on this thing. That means we will have to begin by cutting off the remaining frame not wanted and making some new pieces that will get us what we need for structural rigidity here, so that we don't die when we're going 150 plus mile per hour on this freaking beast. Pro tip: when you are calculating and measuring things out to get a rough idea for a certain length with any certain bends, be sure to always add some inches onto it for what I like to refer to as squish room. This comes in handy for lots of stuff, like short bends on the Harbor Freight bender so you can actually reach the other side for the bend, or when cutting out a half moon on the old hole saw jig. Hell, I even had squish room on a date night with me lady so that she thinks she's getting more than she bargained for. So squish room in the end just makes it a win-win for everybody. Newbie tip: I'm not actually a professional, but I can definitely get the job done, and one way I do that is when creating angles to clearly define a few things on my mock-up pieces, like drawing a line to tell myself this is where something needs to start or stop. I will also draw a center line indicating an angle for a bend and which direction the angle needs to point, so I know where to line up the bend on the piece. This is a simple hack on a very simple bending machine to achieve more streamlined results that has worked extremely well for me. Getting there. Quick side note, I made a mistake here and wound up cutting my piece 2 inches too short, so instead of wasting the entire piece and starting from scratch, I did wind up doing a raw set style joint here to extend my piece to the desired length. Not technically ideal, but it is correctly done in this instance for the correct amount of strength, and we will also be adding some gussets before doing the final welding, which will only add more and more strength to the entire frame. right side is officially braced, and we can now move on to something much easier like the left side. Easier because it is a shorter length, and we can now choose to go wherever we want to connect to, because we don't have a removable piece to worry about over on this drive side of the ATV. I really am in love with how this machine is coming together. There's nothing that gives me more pure satisfaction than seeing a plan start to take shape and unfold into something wicked awesome.
Windows down, driving down the 405, sing along to the radio. We're gonna make it someday, nothing's gonna get in our way. We will be the biggest band in town. Round and round the world we'll go, putting on the greatest show. So make sure that you don't miss out, just be there. We're taking our shot, bring what you got. We're going all the way to the top. We will hear the sound of 1 million people screaming our names when we're backstage. We'll play loud, surfing the crowd. Everybody's jumping around. Yeah, that's the place where I wanna be. Going on stage, headline on a Saturday night. Oh, 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 Saturday night. Oh, oh, oh. I'm gonna quit my job. Never wanna have no bar. I just wanna play my rock and roll like they do on the radio. Mommy's got brand new drums, and I still have my old guitar. And John said this next song's gonna be real good, if you know what I mean. Round and round the world we'll go, putting on the greatest show. So make sure that you don't miss out, just be there. We're taking our shot, bring what you got. We're going all the way to the top. We will hear the sound of 1 million people screaming our names when we're backstage. We'll play loud, surfing the crowd. Everybody's jumping around. Yeah, that's the place where I wanna be. Going on stage, headline on a Saturday night. Oh, 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 Saturday night. Oh, oh, oh.
Upper portion of the frame is now complete. We can move on to some of the easier things, like finding a location for the oversized large and in charge battery that this engine requires. A little backstory here. I bought the largest battery I could for this engine because I have done a lot of research on these crossplane R1's design, and a lot of people complain about how much of a pain in the ass they can be to get initially started up because the firing order of the pistons is much different than a standard flat plane crankshaft inline 4-cylinder engine. So now we get the fun of finding a home for this gigantic Caltric battery. I think making the mounts for this battery should be fairly easy. I'll grab some angle iron off the shelf and just cut 2 pieces to length, and hopefully this will be all we will need to mount this battery.
We will hear the sound of 1 million people screaming our names when we're backstage. We'll play loud, surfing the crowd. Everybody's jumping around. Yeah, that's the place where I wanna be. Going on stage, headline on a Saturday night. Oh, 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 Saturday night. Oh, oh,
Battery is mounted. Now let's move to those bottom 2 frame tubes that we cut out in the last episode. We have to get those reconnected to the bottom frame rails so it makes the front end suspension area of the frame rigid and strong again. What you'll see me doing here is cutting out a section of the old frame and then randomly switching to a new piece because I realize that these pieces are not long enough for what I want to do and have no bend in them, which is a problem on the passenger side where the frame is removable. This is because we can't let the intersection happen after our removable joint, so it has to have a bend, and a tiny 5-inch cut just won't fit in the bender. So we'll just have to start with a fresh piece instead. Alright guys, and now that we got our front down tubes done on the frame, we can move on to the last finishing pieces, hopefully before getting this thing into the powder coat oven, before we can get this thing running and riding. Guys, we have to finish up a couple little things. We have some gussets on the frame. I would like to do some gussets, make this thing 10 times stronger than it already is. We've also got to do a gas tank for this thing. We're keeping the fuel injection, obviously, so we've got to create some sort of gas tank for this thing. I have some ideas. We'll talk about that here in a second. And then we also have to do the shifter assembly. Interestingly enough, the shifter is in a really unique place on this R1 bike. It's all the way up here above the sprocket. It's not even below the sprocket, but at least we'll have the room to do some sort of linkage assembly type deal on this to be able to run that down to the shifter. So let's go ahead and get those things done, and then that should complete this before it's ready to go in for some powder coat. I'm going to try my best to keep these gussets as simple as possible in the essence of saving time to get this done in time for Sandwars. If you want to get super technical for the most amount of strength as possible, then I highly recommend you cut the ends of your tube with a hole saw bit so that the fitment is super tight. I didn't do that here. Pro tip, if you are a good MIG welder, then you can probably fill in some gaps properly. Yup, that's what I'm going to do here. I'm using a circular saw with a giant grinder disc on it to cut some 45-degree angles on some pieces of half-inch tube. Then we're going to weld them into position around certain parts of the frame for added rigidity and strength. It's finally time to move on from the gussets. Let's brutally attack this shifter and knock this one out of the park. We'll start by installing the OEM foot peg and heel guard and get a good idea where everything has to land first. This should be a pretty good simple idea, but we're just literally going to take a 14mm bolt, which has the same rough inner diameter as the shift lever, and we will literally weld that right to the frame because I just don't have the time to order a bolt with an actual shoulder on it designed for this specific purpose. I'll stick the bolt onto my lathe and machine some of it off of the end, and then add a groove for a circlip, and I'll stick a washer behind it to help keep the shifter in place. We will also have to cut down the aluminum linkage rod and weld it back together. I noticed this has a quick shifter on it, but I'm also not sure who makes this one since there's no markings on it. Also, long story short, but either the brain is missing to operate the quick shifter or the ECU is directly flashed for it. However, I can't find the type it is to be able to cross-verify that information, so the quick shifter could just be rendered useless altogether. Quick side note, you won't see it here, but I did wind up cutting down that linkage rod a second time when I realized we needed a more exclusive way for the rod and arm to work together. So what we will wind up doing is cutting this random weird pressed together bolt thing that connects the lever and the heim joint together so that I can flip it to the other side of the lever for some room behind the foot peg. Also, we did wind up cutting the lever apart, since the angle and length was going to need to change anyways. With the shifter complete, it's time to move on. We are starting to have a more complete ATV now. Next step, radiator placement. Let's remove all of the excess material left over from the frame cuts we did in the last episode. That way we have as much room as possible in between the engine and the front of the frame. This was pre-planned. I kept the engine as far back to the swing arm as I could when mounting it, that way we had room up front for more fun activities, if you catch my drift. Making the mounts for the radiator was very simple. I just took some of my leftover cutoffs from the tubing and I cut them in half, laid them onto the cement and smashed them with a hammer to flatten them out. Then bend them for some shape and drill some holes and call her good. Alright, so let's have a quick look at some of our modifications that we've done to this bike today. We've got the radiator installed. You can see we have lots and lots of clearance. Nothing is touching the frame. She's looking really, really good. We've got all our gussets done along the entire frame. We've got the battery installed. All I have to do is trim the air box when I get the full air box in. I'm not going to do it on the half one. I'm going to trim the front off, then this will sit down flush, and the air filter will have enough room for the air to go through the back. I did do this one off camera, the back brake lever. I got that guy bent up. You can see we've got just the tiniest bit of, literally like an inch in between the foot peg and the engine for this brake lever to go up and down, and then just enough room for the clutch cable to come right through here without touching anything. It was almost like this engine was made to be put into this frame. And if we go over here to the driver's side of the ATV, oh man, I forgot to bring my light over here, but you guys can see we got the shifter assembly all done. She's in position. I like the way it sits. Feels good on my foot. The length is good. I've got it all bent into position and where I like it. It's a little loose. I might have to do something to tighten this up a little bit. I don't like how loose that is, but it's in and it works. And that's the most important thing, right? And then I think that's as far as we are right now, but we have one more thing to do before we can get this thing into the oven in the next video. We have to do the fuel cell. So I've got an idea. I'll be right back. All right, guys, if I'm being really honest here, I am almost 100% certain that this is the last piece we need to do on the Yfz450R before we can do, basically to put this in the powder coat, get it powder coated, get it in the oven, actually finish weld everything first, then powder it, then put it in the oven, cook it up, do the second layer, get it all put together, do the wiring, rebuild the engine, and then we can get this thing running. But without that long list of things to do, I believe this is the last thing we're going to do in today's video, unless I magically come up with some random thought where I'm like, oh crap, we have to do this before we can pull the motor out. I'm pretty certain that this is the last thing we're gonna take. This is a fuel cell that I've had sitting up on one of my 12-foot high shelves for probably the better part of 3 years, collecting quite a bit of dust. We're gonna take this, and we're gonna mold it and shape it into a way that it fits in between the subframe rails, or just somewhere in here. It's gonna fit in here. And I think we're gonna do this in a way where, because this is the fuel sending unit for the R1, and this has to be on the bottom, basically, so that all the fuel gets sucked in by the fuel pump and pushed out this line here. So we're gonna make a box. Let's take a few minutes. I'm gonna do a cardboard layout, kind of get an idea of how I want this thing to look, and then we're gonna trace it out onto this. That way we're gonna have the most minimal amount of welds on this thing, but we'll get into that in the voiceovers here in just a few minutes. Hang out, guys. I'll see you in a sec. This will be the very first fuel cell I will ever make. Obviously, I have welded many pieces of aluminum over the past 10 years, including radiators that are under intense pressure, so sealing a box to hold fuel together should really be a breeze. There's a couple different ways I thought of to attack this one. We could take some poster board and make a box from that first, so we know the exact length of each piece. And if I had a sheet of aluminum, this would be ideal, because then we could turn that poster board tank, cut it in a way that we could lay it out flat onto the aluminum sheet to cut it out, and save a ton of welding. However, that's not the case here. Since we are reusing this $20 fuel cell and we have to cut it up, I just decided to take some good, thorough, rough measurements and add some squish room and go to town cutting and welding everything together. I even reused the original tank mounts here just to save a buck. So we have a problem. This fuel cell's aluminum sheeting is not really thick enough to be a flange to support the weight of the fuel sending unit hanging inside on it. So I'm going to take some 1/4-inch thick aluminum and make a really thick flange to weld to the inside of the tank to make sure this stays flat and even always. After about 10 minutes of struggling with every tool in my shop, I decided to finally give in and plasma cut this flange out. I'm going to take it really slow so that we can be sure to create a nice, even, and flat flange here. I did do a 15-minute water leak test on the tank to be sure my welds are sealed well, and we did pass with a minor leak around the threads of the bottom flange, which honestly, I knew that would be an issue anyways, and that I'd wind up thread taping them eventually. If you guys like this build so far, drop me a comment below and let me know. I love reading your guys' feedback in my spare time, even if you aren't happy with something I did or didn't do. I'm still happy that you took the time to share. Time is valuable, so don't waste it. Also, don't forget, me and cameraman Wes will be heading to Sandwars in Waynoka, Oklahoma at the Little Sahara Sand Dunes from October 9th until the 12th. Hope to see a bunch of you guys there.